In the span of just 16 months, between August 1937 and November 1938, the Soviet state executed approximately 750,000 of its own citizens and sent nearly as many to labor camps in the most concentrated campaign of political murder in modern European history. The epicenter of this slaughter was Moscow, where a single man, Nikolai Yezhov, the diminutive head of the NKVD, signed death warrants in stacks so thick that his ink pen had to be refilled multiple times per sitting. But how did an entire society, one that had already survived revolution, civil war and famine, arrive at a point where neighbors denounced neighbors, fathers vanished from dinner tables, and the very architects of the Soviet state were dragged before show trials and forced to confess to crimes they had never committed? To understand the machinery of the Great Terror, you have to feel the texture of daily life in the Soviet Union of the mid-1930s. By 1936, the worst of the collectivization famine was over. Industrial output was climbing. The new Soviet constitution, adopted in December of that year, was hailed by Stalin himself as the most democratic in the world. It guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the inviolability of citizens' persons and homes. On paper, the USSR was entering a golden age. In reality, the constitution was a mask stretched over a face already contorted with suspicion. Stalin had spent the early 1930s consolidating power, eliminating rivals not through debate but through exile, imprisonment, and increasingly through bullets. The assassination of Sergei Kirov in Leningrad on December 1, 1934, had given Stalin a pretext, or, as many historians suspect, a pretext he himself may have engineered, to begin purging the Communist Party of anyone whose loyalty he questioned. But what came next dwarfed anything the party had seen before. The question was no longer who was disloyal. The question became, who could prove they were loyal enough? The mechanism that turned suspicion into mass murder was NKVD Order No. 00447, signed by Yezhov on July 30, 1937. This single document is one of the most chilling bureaucratic artifacts of the 20th century. It divided the Soviet population into categories of enemies: former kulaks, criminals, members of outlawed political parties, clergy, White Army veterans, and assigned each Soviet republic and region a quota. Not a quota for arrests, a quota for executions. Category 1 meant death. Category 2 meant 8 to 10 years in the Gulag. The quotas were not maximums, they were minimums, and regional NKVD chiefs, desperate to demonstrate their revolutionary vigilance, routinely requested increases. The Politburo approved them almost without exception. In the Western Siberian region alone, the initial quota called for 5,000 executions. The final number exceeded 20,000. This was not chaos. This was industrialized terror, managed with the same production targets that governed Soviet steel output or wheat harvests. And the consequences of failing to meet your quota were identical to the consequences of failing to meet any Soviet quota. You yourself became a suspect. If this is the kind of history that makes you rethink what you thought you knew about the 20th century, consider subscribing. This channel exists for one reason: to pull back the curtain on the inner mechanics of Soviet and Cold War history, the kind of stories that don't make it into most textbooks. Joining costs nothing, but it helps this work reach more people who want to understand how power really operated behind the Iron Curtain. Now, to grasp how the terror felt on the ground, step inside a communal apartment in Moscow in the autumn of 1937. These apartments, kommunalki, housed multiple families sharing a single kitchen and bathroom. Privacy was a fantasy. Every whispered conversation could be overheard through thin walls. Every late-night knock on the door echoed down the corridor, and the knocks came almost exclusively between midnight and 3 in the morning. NKVD arrest teams preferred the darkness. They arrived in black sedans, Black Marias, or Black Ravens as Muscovites called them, and the sound of a car engine idling outside your building at 2 a.m. was enough to stop your heart. Families developed rituals. Some kept a small suitcase packed by the door, a change of underwear, a toothbrush, a piece of bread. Wives learned not to scream when their husbands were taken. Screaming attracted attention. Attention attracted suspicion. Suspicion attracted the next knock. The scale of the arrests was staggering, but the randomness was what made the terror truly unbearable. Marxist theory held that enemies of the state belonged to identifiable class categories: bourgeoisie, kulaks, imperialist agents. But by 1937, these categories had been stretched so thin that virtually anyone could be fitted into one. A factory worker who had once made a joke about collective farming could be classified as a Kulak sympathizer. An engineer whose bridge design failed could be accused of deliberate sabotage, or wrecking, the catch-all charge that turned technical incompetence into treason. A schoolteacher who had once corresponded with a relative abroad was an obvious spy. The logic was circular and self-reinforcing. If enemies existed everywhere, then anyone who denied their existence was either blind or complicit. And if the NKVD arrested someone, the arrest itself was treated as proof of guilt. Innocence was not a meaningful concept. The system did not require it. Consider the case of Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the most brilliant military minds in Soviet history. Tukhachevsky had helped win the Russian Civil War. He had modernized the Red Army, championing mechanized warfare and deep battle doctrine years before the Germans developed their own blitzkrieg tactics. By the mid-1930s, he was Deputy People's Commissar of Defense, one of the 5 original marshals of the Soviet Union. On May 22, 1937, he was arrested. Within weeks, he was charged with being a German and Japanese spy, with plotting a military coup against Stalin, and with conspiring to restore capitalism. The evidence was fabricated. Some of it was literally forged by the NKVD, and some, according to later investigations, may have originated from disinformation planted by Nazi intelligence services, who understood that eliminating Soviet military leadership would weaken their future adversary. Tukhachevsky was tried in a closed military tribunal on June 11, 1937. The trial lasted 1 day. He was shot that same night. His wife, his 2 brothers, and 2 of his sisters were subsequently arrested. His wife was executed. His mother died in a camp. His daughter was sent to an orphanage under a false name. The purge of the military that followed Tukhachevsky's execution consumed 3 of the 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, and 154 of 186 division commanders. When the Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union 4 years later, the Red Army's catastrophic early losses owed a direct debt to the fact that its most experienced officers were already dead. Here is a statistic that deserves to sit with you for a moment. In 1937 and 1938, the NKVD executed more Soviet citizens than had died in all of the combat losses of the Russian Empire during the entirety of World War I. This was not a war against an external enemy. This was a state devouring itself. The show trials were the public face of the terror, but they represented only its most theatrical dimension. 3 major Moscow trials were held between 1936 and 1938, each targeting a different constellation of Old Bolsheviks, men who had made the revolution alongside Lenin himself. The first, in August 1936, put Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev in the dock. These were not obscure functionaries. Zinoviev had been chairman of the Communist International. Kamenev had been chairman of the Moscow Soviet, and acting head of state. Both had been members of Lenin's innermost circle. Both had clashed with Stalin in the 1920s, and both had already been expelled from the party, readmitted, expelled again, and imprisoned. Now they were charged with organizing the murder of Kirov and plotting to assassinate Stalin himself. Under interrogation methods that included sleep deprivation, psychological torment, threats against their families, and in some cases physical beatings, both men confessed. Their confessions were broadcast on radio and printed in Pravda. They were found guilty and executed within hours of the verdict. The confessions baffled foreign observers. Western journalists who attended the trials, including the New York Times correspondent Walter Duranty, noted that the defendants appeared to confess freely, even eagerly. How could men who had spent their lives fighting for revolution suddenly admit to betraying it? The answer lay in a combination of coercion and ideology. The NKVD interrogators worked in shifts, keeping prisoners awake for days, weeks, sometimes months. They used a technique called the conveyor, continuous interrogation by rotating teams until the prisoner's psychological resistance collapsed entirely. But coercion alone does not explain the confessions. Many of the old Bolsheviks had spent their entire adult lives inside the party. The party was their identity, their family, their reason for being. When the party declared them enemies, some part of them accepted the verdict, not because they believed the specific charges, but because they believed the party could not be wrong. If the party needed their confession to protect the revolution, then confession was their final act of loyalty. Arthur Koestler's novel Darkness at Noon, published in 1940, explored this psychological territory with devastating precision, and it was based heavily on the real fates of men like Nikolai Bukharin, who would stand trial in March 1938. Bukharin's case is perhaps the most psychologically complex of all. Once described by Lenin as the darling of the whole party, Bukharin had been one of the foremost Marxist theorists in the world. He had edited Pravda. He had drafted the Soviet constitution. He had opposed Stalin on collectivization, and for this he had been gradually marginalized. But he had not been arrested, not yet. Through 1936 and much of 1937, Bukharin lived in a state of suspended dread, writing desperate letters to Stalin protesting his innocence, letters that were by turns defiant, pleading, and eerily philosophical. He knew what was coming. Everyone knew. In February 1937, at a Central Committee plenum, Bukharin was publicly accused. He went on a hunger strike. Stalin mocked him for it. By March 1938, Bukharin stood in the dock alongside 20 other defendants, charged with espionage, wrecking, and plotting to murder Lenin, a man who had been dead for 14 years and who had been Bukharin's personal friend and mentor. Bukharin's behavior during the trial was extraordinary. He confessed to the general charge of conspiring against the Soviet state, while systematically denying every specific allegation. He turned the courtroom into a philosophical seminar, dissecting the logic of the prosecution's case, even as he accepted its conclusion. The chief prosecutor, Andrei Vyshinsky, a man whose courtroom style combined theatrical rage with meticulous legal sadism, raged at him, but Bukharin would not be entirely broken. It did not save him. He was found guilty and executed on March 15, 1938. Before his arrest, he had dictated a final letter to his young wife, Anna Larina, asking her to memorize it because he knew no written document would survive. She carried those words in her memory for more than 20 years, through her own arrest, imprisonment, and exile, until she was finally able to write them down after Stalin's death. The terror reached far beyond Moscow in Ukraine. The NKVD decimated the local party leadership, the intelligentsia, and the cultural elite. The Ukrainian language itself was treated as a marker of nationalist deviation. In the Soviet Far East, ethnic Koreans, some 172,000 people, were forcibly deported to Central Asia in September and October 1937, the first instance of an entire ethnic group being collectively punished by the Soviet state, a precedent that would be repeated with catastrophic effect during World War II against Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, and others. In Leningrad, the NKVD carried out mass executions at the Levashovo wasteland, a site whose existence was officially denied until 1989. Across the country, mass graves were dug in forests, ravines, and abandoned quarries. The killing sites at Butovo and Kommunarka, on the outskirts of Moscow, processed thousands of bodies. At Butovo alone, more than 20,000 people were shot between August 1937 and October 1938. The bodies were buried in trenches. For decades, the land above them was used for farming. Inside the NKVD itself, the terror created its own ecosystem of incentives and fears. Officers who failed to extract confessions were suspected of harboring sympathy for enemies. Officers who extracted confessions too slowly were suspected of incompetence or worse. The pressure to produce results, meaning signed confessions, names of co-conspirators, and evidence of ever wider plots, drove interrogators to escalating brutality. And every confession that named new conspirators generated new arrests, which required new confessions, which named still more conspirators. The system fed on itself. Yezhov, the man at the top of this machinery, was himself a product of its logic. Small in stature, barely 5 feet tall, and a heavy drinker, Yezhov had risen through the party apparatus not through brilliance but through ruthless obedience to Stalin. He embraced the terror with an enthusiasm that even Stalin found useful, at least for a time. The period of the mass purges became known as the Yezhovshchina, the Yezhov era, a naming convention that conveniently allowed Stalin to later blame the excesses on a single subordinate rather than on the system that produced them. And this brings us to one of the most darkly ironic chapters of the entire terror. By the autumn of 1938, Stalin had begun to signal that the purges had gone too far, not because he was troubled by the killing, but because the terror was consuming the very bureaucratic and military infrastructure the state needed to function. Factory production was suffering because managers had been arrested. Military readiness was collapsing because officers had been shot. The party apparatus itself was being hollowed out. Someone had to take the blame, and it would not be Stalin. On November 25, 1938, Yezhov was removed as head of the NKVD and replaced by Lavrenti Beria. The transition was managed with exquisite cynicism. Yezhov was initially given a minor post as Commissar of Water Transport, a demotion so absurd it might have been designed as a humiliation. Then he was arrested, charged with espionage, treason, and in a detail that reflected Stalin's personal cruelty as much as anything, homosexuality. Yezhov was tried in a closed session on February 3, 1940, and executed the following day. According to accounts from prison guards, he wept and collapsed and had to be dragged to the execution chamber. The man who had signed hundreds of thousands of death warrants died begging for his life. The machine he had operated consumed him with the same indifference it had consumed everyone else. Beria, his successor, did not dismantle the terror, he refined it. The mass quotas were abolished, the random, indiscriminate arrests slowed, but the Gulag continued to expand. The NKVD continued to operate, and political repression remained a fundamental tool of Soviet governance for the rest of Stalin's life and in diminished but persistent form for decades after. What Beria understood, and what made him arguably more dangerous than Yezhov, was that terror did not need to be constant to be effective. It only needed to be possible. The memory of 1937 and 1938 was enough to ensure compliance for a generation. People did not need to be arrested. They only needed to know that they could be. The social fabric of the Soviet Union was rewoven by the terror in ways that persisted long after the killing stopped. Trust between individuals was poisoned. The practice of denunciation, donos, as it was called, became embedded in everyday life. Some denunciations were motivated by genuine ideological conviction. Many more were motivated by personal grudges, professional rivalries, the desire for a neighbor's apartment, or simple fear that failing to denounce someone else would make you look complicit. Children were taught in school to emulate Pavlik Morozov, the boy martyr of Soviet propaganda, who had supposedly denounced his own father to the authorities. Whether the Morozov story was true, embellished, or entirely fabricated mattered less than its function. It established the principle that loyalty to the state superseded loyalty to family. In such an environment, silence itself became a survival strategy. People learned not to speak about those who had disappeared. Photographs were altered. Names were erased from official records. The Soviet Union became a society engaged in a collective act of forgetting, even as the trauma of what had happened shaped every institution, every relationship, every whispered conversation for decades to come. There is one more dimension of the Great Terror that deserves attention, because it reveals something essential about the relationship between ideology and violence. The terror was not, in its architects' minds, an act of madness. It was an act of revolutionary hygiene. Stalin and his inner circle genuinely believed, or at least acted as though they believed, that the Soviet Union was surrounded by enemies, infiltrated by spies, and threatened by internal saboteurs who would stop at nothing to destroy the socialist project. This was not entirely paranoid fantasy. Foreign intelligence services did operate in the USSR. Opposition to the regime did exist, but the gap between the real threat and the imagined threat was so vast that it amounted to a kind of political psychosis. And the ideology itself provided the framework for that psychosis. Marxism-Leninism taught that history was a struggle between classes, that the enemies of the proletariat would never voluntarily surrender, and that vigilance was the highest revolutionary virtue. When you combine that worldview with unchecked power, a secret police apparatus answerable to no law, and a leader whose personal insecurities drove him to see betrayal in every shadow, the result is not an aberration. It is a system functioning exactly as designed. The rehabilitation of the terror's victims began cautiously under Nikita Khrushchev, who in his famous secret speech of February 1956 acknowledged that innocent communists had been executed on fabricated charges. But Khrushchev's revelations were selective. He condemned the purge of loyal party members, but said almost nothing about the far larger number of ordinary citizens who had been killed, the peasants, workers, priests, and ethnic minorities who had never held a party card. Full reckoning did not come until the Glasnost era under Mikhail Gorbachev, when the organization Memorial began documenting the names and fates of individual victims. Even then, the reckoning was incomplete. In 2021, The Russian government designated Memorial a foreign agent and subsequently ordered its liquidation. The organization that had spent 3 decades cataloging the victims of Soviet repression was itself repressed. The echo of 1937 was not a metaphor, it was a method. What does the Great Terror teach us? Not simply that authoritarian regimes kill. That is obvious. What it teaches is something more precise and more unsettling. That bureaucratic systems, once given permission to identify and eliminate enemies, will generate enemies to justify their own existence. The terror was not driven by a single madman, though Stalin's pathology was essential to it. It was driven by thousands of functionaries who followed orders, met quotas, signed documents, and went home to their families. It was driven by a society that had been conditioned to believe that the collective mattered more than the individual, that the party was always right, and that doubt was treason. It was driven by fear, not just the fear of the state, but the fear of being seen as insufficiently afraid. In the end, the Great Terror consumed revolutionaries and peasants, generals and factory workers, true believers and innocent bystanders, and it left behind a silence so deep that parts of it have never been broken. The unmarked graves at Butovo, Komunarka, Levashovo, Sandermok, and Bukhivnia still hold their dead. Most of the names above those graves were unknown for half a century. Some remain unknown still. The earth remembers what the state tried to erase, and the story of what happened between 1937 and 1938 is not a closed chapter. It is a warning, written in the bones of 750,000 people, about what becomes possible when a government decides that its survival matters more than the lives of those it governs.